Once upon a time in history, films contained no sound. That means there weren't any sound effects or dialogue accompanying the visuals. Yes, no voice dubbing, voiceover, or sound effects were added to the film. For the modern generation, this may be hard to comprehend. Interestingly, the concept of combining sound and visuals was not necessarily a foreign concept to film studios. In fact, one could say it's as old as film itself. But because of the major technical difficulties involved, the films remained silent till the late 1920s. The period before the transition into sound was known as the silent era. One may ask, if there was no sound, how could you tell what the actors were saying? Just like a typical sci-fi film would provide us with the exposition by use of titles at the beginning of a film, silent films would make use of the same method. Instead, they would place the titles between the dialogue. These titles are commonly referred to as the intertitles. Intertitles at a point became graphic elements containing abstract art or illustrations. They would describe the action or enhance the film's atmosphere or mood. The title writer was a significant crew member in the silent era and was separate from the scenario writer of the film. Sound enhanced the art of film. Later, silent films were replaced by talking pictures, or talkies as they would call them. Many of the film traditionalists were not fans of this change, as they believed this transition had a negative impact on the aesthetic quality of films. The gradually degrading quality was not due to sound. Often the films were adapted for television, and they may have been extracted from a generation of copies which were from damaged stock. They would end up being played at incorrect speeds, accompanied by inharmonious music. The modern audience has expressed how they find silent films to be boring. Some film geeks have expressed their distaste for silent films. They only watch them for educational purposes. It could be due to the seemingly shallow stories, extended scenes where nothing significant happens, as well as the exaggerated acting, or simply the lack of dialogue and sound effects, which would normally add dimension to a story. However, during the silent era, people considered them masterpieces. What is my take on silent films? Well, I believe people judge them from a close-up. Let's pull the camera back and have a look at the wider shot. You must probably be thinking it must have been extremely awkward to sit in a cinema where the only thing audible was the shuffling of popcorn and the sounds of people making out. Surprisingly, it wasn't as awkward as you think. An in-house musician or musicians would often play to a score. In the primitive years of silent films, the score was improvised. But later, as film advanced, scores with a specific cue sheet were provided to the cinemas. Some composers would manipulate certain instruments to sound like sound effects. This added dimension to the films, as it helped identify the mood, atmosphere, and feeling in a scene. In Japan, films grew to have a benshi, which was a narrator who voiced over the film or provided character voices. Yes, the irony is that the silent films contained an adequate measure of music. This must have been a great experience. I would have killed just to experience watching a silent film within these circumstances. It must have been a thrilling experience. Another interesting aspect was the acting. The term exaggerated would not be an appropriate description when describing the performances. Rather, I would say there was great emphasis on the body language and facial expressions. This would seem like a logical approach. Think of modern music videos that contain no dialogue. The actors in the music videos often have to place emphasis on their actions to communicate the message clearly. Silent films were shot differently to sound films. The acting, combined with the low rate the film was shot at, provided these jerky, comical performances, which is probably why most of the popular silent films today tend to be the comedies. I believe it would be a challenge to perform in a silent drama, as the actor would require a high degree of skill to act out the subtlety. It would be interesting to see an actor such as Ryan Gosling, who is a master in this field, attempt to pull this off. There were plenty of silent films which were produced. Most of them will remain a mystery as they were lost. I was reading a list of lost films. I came across an interesting title which reminded me of a modern film, The Great Gatsby. It would be very interesting to witness a silent version of this film. The production of silent films decreased shortly after sound was introduced. What impact did this have on the film industry? Let's take a look at what the atmosphere was like on set during the silent era.